I've invited back a great friend of the program, Hans von Spakovsky, who's a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he is the manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative. Hans, welcome back, and Good Friday.
Well, thank you, Lars. It's great to be with you again.
So tell me this. The president has already said there's a bad idea, it's open to fraud. I want you to persuade the people listening, because they don't have to believe me. I think it's open to fraud as well, and I think one of the biggest problems is it's hard to detect the fraud if it goes on by the very nature of vote by mail.
No, that's exactly right. What people need to understand is that absentee balloting, voting by mail, is done outside of the supervision of election officials. So that means they can't monitor it, they can't prevent intimidation and pressure on voters, and there's almost no check on the system. And a great illustration of this is the fact that years ago, a assistant professor actually at, I think, Portland State University in Oregon did a survey of just one county, Washington County, and in her survey, 5% of the people admitted that someone else had filled out their ballot, and 2.5% admitted that somebody else signed their ballot. Now, she said it was probably a lot higher than that, because most people don't want to admit that they're a party to a crime. But look, take that 5% that just in one county in Oregon people admitted, yeah, somebody else filled out my ballot. Well, you expand that to the entire state, and literally that means tens of thousands of ballots were filled out by somebody else. And there are so many cases of absentee ballot fraud, particularly in places where they allow vote harvesting. They allow candidates, party activists, political guns for hire to go to people's homes and pick up their absentee ballots. And just look at the 2018 election, North Carolina, congressional district, the only contested race in the country, and they overturned the election. Why? Because a political consultant working for one of the candidates was going and collecting absentee ballots and then filling them out, changing them, forging signatures, et cetera. That's what happens when you put ballots in the hands of people who have a stake in the outcome.
Well, and even if you take it to a milder level than that, Hans, imagine this. You have a husband and wife, or boyfriend and girlfriend. Yeah. One of them cares a lot about voting and is really involved. The other one doesn't care. But they're automatically registered because the Democrats have pushed through automatic registration. Oregon is one good example of that. But I think it's spread across most of the country. So your girlfriend gets a ballot, and you say, are you going to vote? No. Well, I'd really like I like Bernie, or I like Joe Biden, and so you encourage her, and she goes ahead and votes. That at a poll election is not allowed. Now, a husband could always say, "Hey, honey, I'm going down to vote. Come with me to the polls," and the wife can say, or husband can say, "No, I'm not interested. I don't intend to vote. I don't believe in voting. Whatever." But when the ballot is sitting right there, it's not at a polling place. One of the standard, restrictions on polling places was you can't go there and politic. You can't wear a T-shirt that pushes one candidate or another. You can't stand 10 feet outside the polls and say to people, "I sure hope you vote for Trump," or "I sure hope you vote for Biden." But with vote by mail, you can do that, and you can also say go into an old folks' home. And ballot harvesting can include saying, "Hey, we're all here to vote. Why doesn't everybody bring their ballot down?" And so you may be pushing people to vote who had no intention of casting a ballot, and you wouldn't have been able to do this to them in a polling place unless, I guess, you shanghaied them and dragged them down to the polling place. But with a ballot that's sitting right there and no controls around how that ballot is filled out, it means that you could bully people into voting and even insist that you see that they voted the way you wanted them to vote, which is another thing that you can't do when you step in that little booth and pull the curtain behind you. All of that is allowed, and there's a reason one party in particular is pushing this, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And here's the other thing for folks to realize. In places like Oregon with all-mail elections, the state just simply automatically mails out a ballot to every registered voter. Well, the problem with that is that registered voter lists are in notoriously bad shape all over the country. And to give you an example of this, listen, years ago when I was in the Justice Department, I was actually at a meeting of election officials in Oregon. And at the very moment that the head of elections in Oregon was talking about, how secure their system was, one of the other election officials from another state leaned over to me and said, well, my sister-in-law lives in Oregon. In the last election, she voted 3 times. And I said, well, how did she do that? She said, well, she voted her ballot, she voted her husband's ballot, and she voted a third ballot that had been mailed to her under her maiden name because she was registered under both her married name and her maiden name. And, of course, how is the state going to catch that? They can't.
No, and it's undetectable. There's another phenomenon. I want you to speak to it before we get to this issue of whether or not Donald Trump can change the date of the election, which is a fraud that's also being pushed. But if you're a young man or woman, many young men and women like to go off to college somewhere other than where mom and dad live. Now, it may be another city in the same state. It may be another city in a different state. But because vote by mail takes place over a period of weeks, sometimes as long, close to a month, it means you could, in theory, go home to mom and dad's on the weekend to visit them. You see, oh, there's a ballot here because I'm registered to vote here. Then you go back to your college dorm or your college housing, and there's another ballot because you're registered to vote there. Is there any system for detecting that kind of duplicate registration in 2 different states?
There's not much of one. There are a couple of states that are members of this consortium that try to compare their voter registration lists. But there are many states who aren't members, big states like New York and California. And listen, that does happen. We just recently added a new case to our voter fraud database of exactly that, a student at the University of New Hampshire who was caught voting in both New Hampshire and Massachusetts, which is where he actually lives.
Yeah, and so there you have a very good opportunity because they're close enough together that student might go home on a regular basis to see mom and dad or see their friends. They pick up the ballot there, they vote there, they think, I really like this candidate. When I go back to college, I'll vote again. And then they can always claim it was an oversight. So the threat that, well, you're committing a federal felony by doing it. 1 minute left. What about this claim that's being used by, among others, the Attorney General of Washington State to raise money for his reelection, that Donald Trump, on his own say-so, could change the date of the November election?
Well, that is a completely bogus claim. The president has no authority under either the Constitution or any federal statute to change the date of the election. The only body that could do that is Congress. They would have to pass a bill. It would have to go through both the House and the Senate. The president would have to sign it. They'd have to pass a bill amending the current federal statute that sets the date of the presidential and congressional elections. The president can't do it.
Which means that at least this year it would have to be a bipartisan move because it would need the support of both Republicans and Democrats in the House and at least in the House and the Senate. And then it would have to go to the president. He'd have to sign it, and it would all have to be done in public where everybody could see it happening. So I say shame on Attorney General Bob Ferguson for going out and raising money on a lie. Frankly, I think that guy ought to be prosecuted for fraud. That's Hans von Spakovsky, Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. It's First Amendment Friday on Good Friday. We'll get to your calls next on the Lars Larson